And like I said, I'll meander with talk a little bit for a minute or two while more people click in. Pleased to have John Marshall join us today. This is kind of a preview of an exhibit that we're going to host that Wallowa Resources is part of, and I forget the technical designation, the Blue Mountain Forestry Cooperative or something like that, John, is that right?
Collaborative.
Collaborative, okay.
Yes.
And John has worked with them, and what this is about is his work as a forester, a fire follower, and a follower also of the Osborne photos of the 1930s. And with that, John, and this exhibit, by the way, will be up here in April at the Josephy Center. So, John, take it away.
All right, thanks. I'm going to minimize the faces here. Is everybody
just a reminder,
okay?
everybody, especially mute yourselves.
Okay, and everybody's hearing me okay? Okay. I guess that this picture
John,
is
excuse me, John. One other reminder. If you have questions, type them in the chat box, and then when we get through it, we'll start a conversation. Or if John sees it in the chat box, he might address it at that time. But he's got quite a few slides to go through. Okay, have at it. I'm sorry.
Okay, very well. Thank you, Rich. Thanks for having me on. I'm a real rookie at this Zoom stuff. This is actually my first participation in a Zoom meeting. Hopefully I will not have trouble navigating the thing. But I'm excited to talk about the topic of fires and Osborne panoramas and what's going on in our forests over the last 80 to 100 years. And I pulled up this picture that has a lot of smoke in it, because that's kind of what sounds like is happening in Wallowa County today. And I sympathize because we've been through it here in Wenatchee. And in fact, my wife developed a respiratory problem with it. She got over it, but it can have some serious health problems. But I'll also say we are going to have to learn how to deal with it, because we're going to get inundated with smoke from time to time. Fire is something we try to dispense with, and in reality, we've really just kind of postponed fire rather than avoiding it. And we're going to have to find better ways to deal with it than we have. And it's going to take a whole society working at it, not just the Forest Service. Anyhow, it's a really, really big topic. All I'm going to be able to do is chew around on the edges of it a little bit today and try and get you excited about the exhibit that we'll be having in mid-April 2021. So with that, I'm going to move ahead here. Much of the exhibit centers around the Osborne panoramas. They're from the 1930s mostly. 3,000 contact prints at the National Archives in Seattle. 13.5 by 4.5 inch prints. I've scanned them, and with scanning, you get more detail than you do just looking at the print in real life. I want to thank the Nature Conservancy of Oregon and Oregon Department of Forestry for paying me to go through the Osbornes at the National Archives. You can see all the high quality ones on the Nature Conservancy's website. At the left there, you see the camera that was used. It's quite an ornate thing with the plywood carrying box. It weighs 75 pounds. And the young men that they hired to take the pictures, were expected to pack it in on their back if the distance was less than 4 miles. If it was more than 4 miles, they got a helper or a pack animal. The camera took 120 degrees of angle. The lens actually swung during the exposure, and the film and back sat on a curved rails to keep it at a constant distance from the back of the lens. So I've been, for the last 10 years, retaking some of these Osborne panoramas. I've been to 71 sites so far, and I don't know, probably done 150 of the panoramas. This is Hat Point, as you're all familiar with. I'll back up a little bit and say I'm no stranger to the Blue and Wallowa Mountains region. I first backpacked in there in 1957. Yeah, but of course at that time I had no awareness of fire ecology, and frankly I didn't really have an awareness of fire ecology when I was a teenager working at Wallowa Lake in the late 60s, or even when I hiked in the 70s and 80s. Today I would look at this and I'd say, well, these are young trees. There must have been some kind of a disturbance that swept out the trees that were there before, and this is what's regrown. And that disturbance could be avalanche or it could be fire. But I've kind of come to understand the landscape as kind of pieces that move around and have vegetation in a different condition at a different point in time. I've always been really, really fascinated by fire. I was never a wildland firefighter, although I have actually been through the training to help me get access for photography. To me, it's one of the most amazing forces in nature, and it can be to good effect or bad effect. You can't broadly categorize it. Here we see streambank hollyhock coming back from the Eagle Fire. On the other side of the Wallowas, it shows an adaptation of a native plant, stays dormant until the seed coat is cracked by fire and then germinates and takes off. Here's another example of a plant adaptation. This is Indian hemp or dogbane, and it's been through a fire. What was on top of the ground was totally burned off, and it's resprouted from the roots, and it's going through a second period of flowering in the same year. So most of you probably heard of ponderosa pine as being fire adapted and living through fires. Lesser known is that lodgepole pine at times actually lives through fires and accumulates fire scars. In order to help people understand fire better, I took on a project in 1994 of starting out with blackened landscapes and following them over time. And I've got over 25 years into this, and I'll just briefly take you through one site. This is what we would call moonscaped. It's pretty abysmal. This is up in the east side of the Cascades on the Eniat Ranger District. Come back the next year and there's a lot of plant life that survived under the ground. Soil's actually a really good insulator. And so a lot of the roots survived and are popped up and a lot of blooming going on. It's kind of a race among plants to see who can come up first and seed first. 6 years later, we've got beautiful, beautiful blooms of balsam root, some of the trees falling down. 2007, essentially all the snags have fallen, but you can't even see the young trees coming up. They're there, they just don't show. And 25 years later, we've got trees that are 15 or 20 feet tall. So that's an example of one site and how vegetation came back from a very hot fire. So I got introduced to the Osborne panoramas by the Forest Service about 10 years ago. They want a reconstruction of some of these panoramas from the Okanagan and Wenatchee National Forest. This one's up in the Methow Valley, up in the Twisp area. And if you look at the I think this is 1930, a lot of completely open area, a forest that wasn't very dense. This would be a low elevation, ponderosa pine, Douglas fir. And you can see how that's just kind of tightened up and spread out. This is a result of not allowing fire to burn. And what that did is it set it up to burn in a very unnatural way because both the density of trees and the amount of accumulated dead fuels made it for a fire that simply couldn't have taken place historically because there wasn't that continuity of fuels, and all it took then was a bad weather window for the fire to really rip. You get on up into the high mountains and fire didn't happen as often in any one particular place. But when you look at a whole landscape, it was pockmarked by fires at different times. And you look at this picture here at the top, and the vegetation is in a wide range of different conditions. And then when you eliminate fire totally off that landscape for 80 years, it kind of all knits over into one kind of amorphous forest. It really changes and becomes less diverse. And when that happens, it really sets it up for very large fires, very huge, high severity patches that didn't happen historically or seldom did. So one of the things that's interesting, this picture is the one area that survived, I think it was the tripod fire of 2006, this one green area, had been recently burned as of the 1934 photo. You can actually, it was actually probably what we would call a reburn. It had burned maybe like 1900 or the late 1890s, and then burned a second time, maybe in the early teens. And so it was really, the fuels were greatly reduced off of this spot. And, you know, you fast forward 80 years later, that's what survived. The fire history has a long tail to it in terms of the past affecting the future. We've also done some work up on Mount Rainier. There were Osborne panoramas taken from there. I should say they were taken everywhere there was a fire lookout. And they had lookouts up on Rainier. Nature Conservancy of Washington paid me for that work. And you can see this glacier right here, the Paradise Glacier, is no longer a feature of Mount Rainier. You still have a good coverage here, but the depth of the ice is less. But the other thing going on in this picture is you look at all the kind of shrubland, herbland habitats that are in the 1930s photo at the top. A lot of barren area that's now forested. And that barren area is really where the huckleberries would be, where the wildflowers would be. where the bears would hang out, that habitat has declined really for a lot of species. So kind of going back to Northeast Oregon, this is a drone photo. I've really embraced the drones. They're a fabulous tool for a photographer. Can get angles you can't get any other way. So we're looking at Hat Point here. And let's see, I think this is a view that's looking north. You can see this was a forest dominated by subalpine fir in 1935. It burned a number of years ago and came in thickly to lodgepole pine. And then part of it burned a second time. Now, a lot of people would view that second burn as tragic, you know, that it started to grow forest back and then it got erased. I don't view it that way at all because lodgepole pine has a habit of seeding itself in so thick that the trees are spaced too close. And what I'm seeing happen is when it reburns, it comes back at a density that's going to grow nice trees. And it also opens up the canopy for some forage for elk and other animals. So although it's too bad this whole thing burned off, I'm really actually happy that this reburn came in and took out pieces of the lodgepole regeneration. Oops, back up here. Okay, yeah, this is sort of zooming in on the same photo. Certainly a very different place, isn't it? And this is looking towards the Wallowa Mountains from Hat Point. Again, this huge fire in lodgepole pine. I'd have to say that looking at the Eastern Oregon Osborne panoramas, I really don't see massive fires. I do see massive fires on the west side of the Cascades. I really didn't see massive fires on the east side of the Cascades historically. And as we all know, we're getting some really big ones now. Zooming in. Then we were looking from Hat Point. If we're looking down at Hells Canyon, here's the Snake River and Hells Canyon. You can see the cottonwoods and I guess probably alders coming up the stream bottom, and they're really diminished because the conifers have invaded. And as a biologist, I can say that has a lot of relevance. I mean, things like warblers, like hardwoods, and this could be very important seasonal habitat for a lot of songbirds, and it's now mostly conifers due to absence of fire. And going through the pictures of the National Archives, this one really caught my eye. And I saw that and I said, I have got to go there. I've got to find this place and get there. It's Red Mountain overlooking McCully Basin. This is Anaride Mountain right here. Anyhow, I hiked in there in 2018 and oops, this one's out of order. Here we go. I hiked in 2018 and did a retake, and you can see this open park-like character to the land is really no longer there. It's very dense forest patches with some small meadow areas, much smaller than in 1935. You can see in 35, there'd been some stand replacing fire. I think there'd probably also been a lot of really low severity fire because it was kind of a savanna, a lot of it, a grassland, and you can have a grass fire without killing a whole lot of trees. But you can see how open and park-like it was and how it densified and the meadows have shrunk. Yeah, this is looking at McCully Creek, 1935 and 2018. Yeah, I mean, just look at how that meadow's shrunk. And then if you look at the timberline side of it, you can see how the subalpine fir has really filled in the spaces between the whitebark pines. The one kind of really positive thing in this is that I really think there's more whitebark pine right up here at the high elevation in 2018 than there was in 1935. And that gives me some hope for whitebark pine into the future. As most of you know, it's been decimated by the white pine blister rust, but it seems to be doing better in the Wallowas than most places. So you kind of get down in McCully Basin, you can see the nitty gritty of what's going on is that in dry years, the conifer trees are able to get established in the meadow. And once they get established in the meadow, they dewater it. They pump water out of the ground and the stream drops. And then that allows even more conifer trees to invade the meadow. And gradually they dewater a meadow and reduce the stream flow. That's what's going on in McCully Basin. The other thing that's going on in there is a tremendous amount of dead wood on the ground. I mean, dead wood on the ground's always been a feature of the forests and actually is important for wildlife habitat. But there's a question of how much of it does wildlife need, and at what point is it really a fire hazard? I mentioned the white pine blister rust. This tree's dying. Probably bark beetle attack following blister rust. Some of the trees are living. They can live with it for a long time, many years. Here's an old dead white bark pine. All right, moving around a little bit. This is Huckleberry Mountain looking down into Goat Creek and Bear Creek. And you get into that and you can see this forest is really young in 1935. It's pretty mature in 2019. And if you look up into this high basin, you can see how open it was up in 1935. And you look at how densified it is now. This is the same story I was talking about McCully Basin. The openings, the gaps between trees and clumps of trees filling in for lack of fire. So I get around to the south side of the Wallowas, a little bit different story there. There was the Eagle Fire. I think it was, what was it, 2015, I think. And, you know, what I'm seeing is a bigger patch. This would have been an awfully big patch historically. Essentially by, for a long time, eliminating fire, we've really begged to have bigger fires when we've had them. This is an example. Okay, so I've shown you some Osborne panoramas. Now let's talk about a good effort to start to fix some of the problem. Granite Gulch fire last year, when I heard that there was a fire in the Wallowas, I naturally looked into it, and I was pleasantly surprised to find that the Forest Service had not shut down that part of the Eagle Cap. And I was actually able to walk in and observe that fire. I'm right up on the divide between the Minam River drainage over here and the Lostine drainage on this side. Pretty cool thing to watch. This is the top of Granite Gulch, a clump of trees torching off. I spent quite a while just kind of watching the fire behavior before I decided I should walk down there. But basically this fire is corralled by, these wet meadows. What would burn would be kind of the drier, more well-drained rocky areas, they would burn. But even at that, it typically burned just a clump of trees at a time. I waited a long time for this to torch. I watched the smoke for a long time, and finally the weather conditions and predict what kind of fire behavior they were going to get out of it, and decided that the effects were mostly going to be good. It was a good call. A lot of the fire was what my friend Paul Hessburg refers to as a skunking around fire. Skunking around meaning that it smolders slowly in the ground. It literally rate of spread is inches per hour, just really, really slow creeping. And then now and then torches a tree, like I showed in the prior picture. So here's some pictures in Granite Gulch from last year. And this is kind of the I guess sort of a poster that for what people have a negative emotional reaction to seeing something like this. But really what it is it's opening up the possibilities for new plant growth and a different kind of vegetation to live in that spot. And I'm hoping to watch this over the years as I have other places. I came back again this year with Paul Hessburg, and we wandered around a bit up in the high area. This is a big trunk off of a white bark pine, and you could say, oh, what a shame, burned up this white bark pine. But that when this falls to the ground, it could be a denning site for, say, an animal like a wolverine. This is what we call mixed severity fire. Some lived, some died, kind of a take some, leave some scenario. And now we're looking down into the upper Minam. This is upstream here. This is what we call a high severity fire patch. And some people might say, oh gosh, that's terrible. We don't want that kind of fire. But that's always been part of the landscape. And probably there'll be some erosion. There may be a gully washer that'll come down here and it'll carry rocks on down to the Minam River. And those rocks will be spawning gravel someday. And it actually needs this episodic, periodic, high severity fire. It's looking down at the bottom of the Minam, and I'm actually going to head back there. I'm just too curious as to what's going on down there. So I'm just going to kind of back up a little bit here and say, this is a shot as I took going home. I camped out 16 miles north of Enterprise up in the forest, and you look at the forest here, and a lot of us would say, oh, that's beautiful and natural and the way it should be. But it's not the way it always was. You back up in time to 1910. Here's a photograph taken north of Enterprise. Not exactly the same place. This is Billy Meadows. But you see how the trees are, ponderosa pine trees are well spaced out. And there's an interesting story behind this picture. They're actually reintroducing elk to Wallowa County. Imagine that. Elk had been so hunted down that they were afraid they were going to go extinct in Northeast Oregon, and they captured elk in Jackson Hole and brought them to Wallowa County in the winter of 1910, 1911. They're carting elk in these crates, and then they later on transferred them to sleighs. I think, oh, I missed a slide. Okay, well, that's okay. So in that era, fire was perceived negatively by the Forest Service. There was actually some debate going on in the period 1908. There were some people that were in favor of what they called light burning. There are other people that weren't. Gifford Pinchot took his cues from the French and set the Forest Service on a course to stamp out all fires. And in fact, we're still stamping them out. We know a lot more, but really in order to allow fires to burn, it takes a social consensus. And it's become more difficult as people move out into forest areas. If you take away fire in a ponderosa pine forest, ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, grand fir, what happens is pretty soon this nice ponderosa pine tree is surrounded by all these young Douglas firs and grand firs, and they grow up around the pine and they rob it of a lot of the water that it would get. And they also make it a way for the fire to get into the crown of the tree. And the only way to avoid that scenario is either to periodically burn it or to do a whole lot of chainsaw work. If you don't do one or the other, you're basically going to doom the forest. So kind of getting around to what brings me together with Josephy Art Center is this exhibit. This is an example of one of the panels I've done that not only has the then and the now and pictures taken in the area, and then a synopsis of what's going on. I co-authored this with Dr. Hessburg, and it's kind of a large exhibit and it takes quite a while to absorb it. But hopefully it will engage people in Joseph. We not only compare Osborne panoramas, we really talk about the biology, the physical side of fire, really kind of give a synopsis of the whole thing. And I'll end with a picture of me. This was at the Sheehan Gallery at Whitman College. That's how the exhibit looks there. Obviously, we're going to need to reconfigure it to fit into Josephy, and it might have to downsize a little bit. But really looking forward to doing that and grateful for the opportunity. And with that, that's the end of my PowerPoint. Let's see if I can get back to the interactive screen for Zoom here.
John, you're whether you get back or not, you can see people on the side panel there.
Let's see. There we go. I see you. All right. I see. Yeah. Okay. So now I have to say, apologize. I didn't answer any questions because I actually didn't see the questions as I was going, but I'm prepared to do that now.
Why don't you do that? Why don't you go to the chat box? There are 2 or 3 questions there.
Okay. I'm looking.
John, do you want me to stop the sharing for you so that you don't have to worry about it?
No, that's okay. I can now see people's faces. I see Jeff, I see Mike, Linda, Ed, Elnora, Pace. I see a bunch of people there, but where's the chat box? Where do I go to that?
If you go to the bottom, you'll see it says security, participants, chat. So click that chat box and it'll open up.
You're
not seeing it?
All right, chat. All right, there we go. Okay, here we go. All right, let's see. Let's go back to the beginning. You've emphasized good fires, but what is a bad fire other than ones that harm homes or people? That's a really good question. I think I would frame it in terms of fire severity and size. And what I like to see in a fire is something that's patchy, that contributes to the heterogeneity of a landscape. And if it just takes out all the trees and over a big area, and it's especially hot, I would call that a bad fire. But I'd also preface that to say that in order to have a bad fire, you have to have a bad fuel situation. Basically, fires are dependent on fuel and ignitions, and if the fuel isn't there to begin with, you're not going to have a bad fire. And so we have to look at the conditions across the landscape. Okay, I'm going down here. A thank you from Jeff. Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Okay, I'm going to, did the seasonal time frame for the original Osborne panoramas basically just run from summer through fall, or was there a tighter window? And do you try to retake photos at roughly the same part of the season as the original? Good question. So in terms of the timing of the panoramas, I've seen them anywhere from March through early November. But they tend to be clustered around, I would say, June, July, August. July, August in particular, because of high elevation. And the ones that tend to run too late in the season oftentimes aren't very good because the north aspects are shadowed in. And as far as what I did is, I have not tried to take them at the same time, really. What I've tried to do is take the best picture I could take to show the conditions as they are in the present day. Because in a lot of cases, I could really take a better picture than they did. So I see it as my job to show what it is today as best as I can. And if it's steep country, north aspect, kind of after about September 1st is too late in the year. If it's flat country, I'd say I could extend out into, say, early November. Let's see. Hi, John. I have retaken photos from a site, Brown Bag Mountain. Would love to share with you. Besides fire and altered vegetation patterns, what are some other landscape changes, roads development, insect outbreaks, climate, that you've seen in the photo comparisons? Well, I would say there's one thing that, one observation I'd say right off, and that is, with the exception of roads in pictures, when you look at the historical photographs, there's almost nothing that has a straight line or a rectangular pattern to it at all. It's all very irregular patterns to the landscape, made by fire, avalanche, insect outbreaks, and none of this kind of little polygons with straight edges that came from clear cutting. That just, wasn't part of the 1930s scene. That stands out more than anything. I'd also say that you see forest crawling out into the shrublands when you compare the modern with the historic. So let's see, I think that's all the questions I see on the chat. I'm happy to answer other questions.
Let's just
Can I throw
open it up.
something in?
What's that?
This is Mike. Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Now I am in service right now at a Forest Service lookout, and I actually printed the Osborne photos for my particular lookout. And unfortunately, there's a really nice CCC building on the premises in 1935, which they have since burnt.
Oh, that's too
I'm
bad.
Yeah, so I'm in the third generation lookout up here, which was built in 1961.
Are you at Hat Point?
No, I'm on the UMF, Umatilla.
Okay, which one?
I'm not allowed to say at this point because I'm at work. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, I've been to quite a few of them on the Umatilla. I've been to a lot of them on the Umatilla. I deliberately made this program short because of the format. But Tower Mountain, up out of Ukiah, and let's see, there's the one up by Tollgate, High Ridge, Bali Mountain. There's a ton of them.
It's
Yeah,
interesting when you look online and print the pictures, there's a catalog of all the lookouts that were in existence in 1935 era. And where I'm working right now, there are probably 4 or 5 times as many lookouts as there are now.
Yeah, right. So when you say a catalog online, are you speaking of the Nature Conservancy website?
I'll have a quick look.
Okay, yeah, there's 2 places you can see these Osborne panoramas. One is a website called I Am Who, and
That's it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep. And that gives you a really good overview of every Osborne panorama that was ever taken, but the resolution is pretty low. If you go to the Nature Conservancy website, you'll be able to see things much more clearly. And you'll also be able to download actually full resolution versions. So, Google the Nature Conservancy of Oregon Osborne panoramas, and you'll be able to see things better.
Thank you.
You bet. Other questions? Somebody, let's see, is somebody waving at me there? Pace, are you waving at me? No? Okay.
So John, for us, for the non-foresters here, can you run through the usual tree succession?
Well, back in college days at the University of Idaho, when I was getting my master's degree, we were taught kind of a cookie cutter succession story which if you were looking up in the higher elevations, we'd start out with lodge, maybe start out with some broadleaf trees and shrubs, and then lodgepole pine and then Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. But I've come to think of succession as not being that simple, that things go every which way, and that it's seldom just a nice progression that we think of. A lot of times it'll go sideways or even backwards. And that I've come to think of these forests as reburning a lot. I mean, they used to teach you that, well, lodgepole pine has 100 to 300 year fire return intervals. I think that's really not the story. That most of the time, the forest comes in seeded, and part of it burns the second time or even a third time. But it may not be a complete burn. It may be a partial burn. Usually it is a partial burn. And it's those reburns that give that amazing heterogeneity. And some of the sites that burned like 3 times end up then being very fuel limited, that will be the places where the fires will stop their march across the landscape in the future. So succession, I think, was kind of a cookie cutter story they taught us back when, and I think we know more now.
Yeah, John, this is Nick Lundy. I totally agree with you. What I've seen, it's very complicated, and there's hardly anywhere I can go out here in the forest and not find charcoal from some era. And interestingly, I've had a lot of experience with Hell's Canyon burning. I had large fires down there, 4 large ones during my tenure. And even in grass, I have seen changes as successive burns go across the same piece of country. As the first time it burned, it was just this line of fire just marching over the ridges in a straight line. And by the second or third time it burned, it was much more fingery. And we even had a big wind one night that blew the fire out in grass on the third reburn. Because it was fuel limited, a lot of that old clumpy bunch grass, dead stuff underneath had been burned out in previous fires and hadn't built up to that extent. And we had this big wind coming, and it was like, oh no, we're going to get hit with this big wind tonight. We're going to have fire everywhere in the morning. And the next day I got up and there was hardly any smoke, and I got in a helicopter and flew, and the fire had blown itself out. So you can't predict this stuff. And then as my career progressed, I started, every time I go out, I'd see fire behavior that I'd never seen before. Usually worse, more extreme because of that fuel buildup and changes in the weather just longer seasons, more extreme conditions. And what's going on in California right now, they're not going to get a handle on it until the weather changes, period. So.
Yeah. Right. Well, thank you, Nick. Everything you said echoes with what I know about it. And I'd have to say, Paul Hessburg will tell you that in terms of total acreage, there was actually a much larger acreage that burned across North America historically on an average year than today. It's just that the fire intensity in general was pretty low because it was fuel limited. The more often you march fire across the land, the less material there is that readily burns. What I really think we need to be doing is looking for more opportunities like Granite Gulch. When weather conditions are favorable for a positive outcome, we let it buck. And when weather conditions are likely to have a negative outcome, we absolutely do everything we can to snuff it out early. But the whole idea we're just going to avoid fire is just fantasy. But I think the one of the biggest concerns is people living out in the forest that have no idea with what's coming down and aren't preparing their homes or their property for what's an inevitable event.
John, or maybe Nick could chip in here. What kind of evidence, we all assume, or we've heard, that the Indians across the West traditionally burn.
Yeah.
After they got the horse, it gave them pasture. Before they got the horse, it made them easier to get through the woods, and it probably regenerated roots and berries. How much do you have? People have asked me, well, what kind of evidence is there other than oral stories? Is there any kind of physical evidence of that?
Well, I mean, Paul has studied the Klamath Reservation area and is determined that there were more fires than could be explained by lightning ignitions alone.
Okay.
And then you add to that, the oral histories, both with what we got from the native people and from the settlers. You add to that, but then you think about it in a logical way. Why wouldn't they have done a ton of burning? Because trees have limited utility to Native Americans. They have some value as shelter, but in terms of food, you get a lot more food out of open areas where there's browse and berries and roots and things than you do with something that's just under tree cover. And so it was their advantage to limit, but not eliminate, tree cover. And there's also a safety factor that if you burned the land early in the spring or in the fall, when weather was such that you were going to have mild fire effects, that gave you a refuge to run to in the heat of the summer because the fuels had been taken out. So I talked to a guy up in the Methow Valley whose his grandfather came in the late 1800s and had a chance to talk to some of the old natives. And what he learned was that every fall they came down out of the high country and they set fire all the way down. They'd have a campfire and just let it run. And they did that annually. And consequently, the fire was low severity. It kept things like grand firs from moving in. It ate up the surface fuels without killing like the larger pine trees. And that had been going on for a long time.
Thank you.
Bet.
Hey, John, just to let you know, there are a couple of comments and questions from Rob Taylor in the chat box.
Yeah, I see the one that says, note the TNC site does not include all of the photos. And I can answer to that there's a fair number of the Osborne panoramas that are really poor quality. And if I looked at a print and said, well, you really couldn't tell much from this, I skipped it. And so the ones that he sees missing were not of high enough quality that I thought that we should bother with them. So that's the answer to that. And I think I already answered the earlier question from Rob Taylor. Yeah, anything else?
Yeah.
John, this is Mike.
Mike?
Yeah. Do you care to offer an opinion on what you think the effects of the COVID-19 epidemic are going to have on various things like prescribed burning, the limited budgets that are going to be in government coffers because of work and that sort of thing, and the fact that right now, even with the smallest of fires, the Forest Service and ODF are hitting everything with whatever they can to make sure they don't go anywhere.
Well, I'm kind of gathering that we're not doing much prescribed burning this year due to COVID, although frankly, the amount of smoke coming out of prescribed burning is pretty minuscule compared to wildfire smoke. But nobody wants to, make a situation worse. COVID, I see, is a bump in the road. In the longer term, I think that we've got to find better ways to protect our indoor air, that we need better filtration systems and ways to protect vulnerable populations from fire and not let air quality get in the way of doing prescribed burning. Because prescribed burning is going to let out less of the harmful fine particles smoke than wildfires. That in the long term, we can't let air quality concerns get in the way of it. But in the short term with COVID, it seems as though we are, but it's just 1 year.
Ron Polk had a question, I think.
Yeah, John, thank you very much. I'm one of those people who lives up in the Lostine Canyon in a vulnerable area, and we up here our group of us who live up here are trying our best to try to deal with the risk of fire by mitigating the risk of damage to our homes. But my question is this: you probably are aware of the efforts by the Forest Service to thin the trees along the Lostine Canyon in an attempt to reduce the fuel load were there to become a serious forest fire. And one of the things that I'm trying to do myself, and a lot of us up here who really don't have any background in this area, is to become more familiar with the rationale for these efforts and to familiarize ourselves with what we can do. And so on the surface, at least, it seems to me that the Forest Service attempt to thin fuel in the Lostine Canyon with the idea of reducing the fire risk to us is a good idea. On the other hand, many of us who moved out here believe, I think, in our hearts that we are conservationists, and we like the idea of trees. And so the counter arguments to the Forest Service, go through the courts. People are claiming that this is really a timber grab and it's really not a safety issue. And I find myself torn because I don't have the background to really understand and appreciate, who's telling the truth. And I'm not even sure I fully understand the source of these disagreements. So could you give me some guidance on how I best would interpret all these conflicting issues that come up in these times?
Sure, Ron. I'm familiar with the Lostine Canyon, and one of the things that strikes me just kind of driving through is a lot of the trees are fairly young. Young in that, they've come in the last 100 years or so. And actually, when I'm driving around, I'm always looking at hillsides and erasing the trees I see is, maybe 100, 125 years old. And then imagining back to what that landscape would be without those trees. And it was a very different landscape. And there's no doubt in my mind that the Lostine in the fire exclusion era has changed, that the forest composition's changed, the density of it, and in addition to the density of live trees, the amount of dead fuels on the ground. And when we were hiking up last week up the West Fork of the Lostine Trail with Paul Hessburg, he commented that half the trees in there had root disease, and that the way you get rid of root disease is to for the forest to burn down and be in broadleaf vegetation for a while. He was commenting on the astounding fuel levels in there, and that historically that West Fork of the Lost Dean might have been a huckleberry patch. If you go back 200 years to when the Native Americans had full reign of things. So there's no doubt the Lost Dean isn't what it was 100, 125 years ago. And, you know, just driving through there, I think it's a nightmare from a fire safety point of view, a recreation management point of view. When you look at how many cars are parked at the end of the Lost Dean River Road, and you think of having to get all those folks safely out of the mountains, that's a nightmare. Now, the field treatments that are going on, from what I've seen so far, is pretty minuscule, although there's a lot of, you know, not all those units have been cut yet, but really the Forest Service hands are pretty tied at the Lost Dean because they've got a narrow strip of land with wilderness on each side. And there's not a whole lot of it that they can treat with cutting. And I really find the whole idea that it's a timber grab to be absurd, because there just isn't the volume in there that if they were motivated by, you know, revenue and cutting timber, that's not where they'd be looking. I don't think it has anything to do with cutting timber and revenue. It has to do with public safety. I think it's a very big concern, and they're really limited. And I would also say, you know, that for, you know, you living up there, your safety is partly dependent upon the conditions on the Forest Service land, and partly dependent on the conditions of your own land. But from what I've seen of studies of homes burning down in wildlands, what matters the most is the 200 is what you control in your most immediate neighbors. And you can do a lot to make your home safer. You may not like the look of it though, because it's not going to give you the privacy that maybe you like. More questions on that?
No, I think it is a complex topic, but thank you for helping put it in perspective for me.
Yeah, you bet.
And I just wanted to really quickly remind
you. We're past.
Hey, Rich, can I just really quickly let people know that I put a link on I was hosting John again tomorrow. So if you were interested and want a little bit more in-depth science to what you saw today, that link is there. John is going to do his presentation starting probably around 10:45 tomorrow morning. That'll go up an hour, and we got John back with. Yeah. Pretty fortunate, John. We're going to get to see you a lot this week. And Dr. Paul Hessburg is actually going to be joining us as well, along with several members of the Wallowa Mountains Office Forest Service, to talk about the Granite Gulch fire a year later. So John, a little bit, but if you want to hear more on that and engage in a conversation, tomorrow morning, John, and tomorrow afternoon, we have John and Paul and some of the Wallowa Mountains staff. So just click on that link, and we'd love to have anybody from the public join us tomorrow.
Where are these links? Where are the links?
In the chat box. If you pull up the chat box before you leave,
yeah, okay.
And scroll up, I put it on there kind of early on, so it's 5 or 6 entries down.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no worries, and we could even put it on the Josephy website this afternoon if you wanted to do that as well. I'm going to leave that to Cheryl and Rich.
Okay.
Like we'll try to get Rich.
We'll try to get the word out. Well, thank you very much, John, for that was really a very great presentation. Love the photos and love the talk about fire. And I'll throw in my 2 bits about COVID. I've been reading books about COVID. And you know, they're still trying to figure out the flu of 1918.
Are they?
For exactly the same reasons as you and Nick were talking about. There are fingers everywhere with those flu. And it's kind of interesting how nature mimics itself with disease and fire.
Very interesting indeed.
Okay.
Well, thanks everyone for logging in and following my program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Now, John, you can just click off. There's a little thing on your right hand down at the bottom of the screen in red.